I built my whole philosophy of sales in really committing to asking great questions to somebody that's shown an interest, and really committing to listening to what do they need, what do they want, what are the problems that they are experiencing, what are the results they'd like to get. Let go, let them make the decisions. If we can do that multiple times a day, a week, a month, a year, then we have a compound effect, albeit a small one, on the globe, where we're just making a tiny weeny difference, and that feels great.
Most leaders want more sales, but they don't want to be salesy. So how can we make sales feel more human, like having real conversations and less of pushing a product? I mean, it's so critical to understand that things have really changed. Think about it. We're in a global recession, essentially. We're more distributed. Everything is online. Sales is now booming on social media, and everything sometimes feels more impersonal. And sticking to the old playbook is no longer enough. What matters now is learning how to connect with your customers on a personal level in order to succeed as a business, which is why I'm so excited about today's guest, Matthew Elwell. Matthew is a trailblazer in sales. His impressive journey from the basics of cold calling to sealing substantial deals, and now as co-founder of the Elite Closing Academy, which trains hundreds of salespeople and business leaders, shows how his unique ability to understand and adapt to the evolving world of sales is so valuable in today's world. His expertise has gained him recognition as a global keynote speaker. He's been on stage with David Goggins and Stephen Bartlett and Lewis Howes and Neil Patel and so many more. He's also the author of Open with a Close, which I actually have a copy of it here, where he shares innovative sales strategies that really resonate in today's market. So if you want to learn how to close more sales whilst being genuine and human in your approach, then this episode is for you. Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury, a serial entrepreneur and founder at AirManual, and I'm joined today by Matthew Elwell. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Mate, honestly, I'd like to roll that up and take it with me everywhere I go, that introduction.
Fantastic. That's very kind. And you're welcome to. You can take the episode to just play it anytime anyone says, so tell me about yourself.
No.
Well, let's go deeper on that. So let's start with how you got to where you are now. Tell us a bit more about your journey, and especially some of those pivotal moments that led you to develop your unique approach to sales.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, I mean, look, my sales journey started like most people's, like by accident. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning when they're 12 and goes, Mummy and Daddy, I want to be a salesperson. And certainly that wasn't me. But yeah, the very first job I took was in the great city of Birmingham, cold calling with no training at all. And I was a ladies' sanitary wear salesperson. And it's fair to say I was absolutely terrible at it. And I remember just having dread every single second I was involved with that first job and thinking, do adults really do this for a living? And there wasn't any training. There wasn't any, it was literally just go and knock doors and get a compliment slip. So what was interesting though, is I love people, and I've always been massively people focused. So I was like, I kind of love the people bit. I don't like the not knowing what to do. And also some of the things I was hearing that you were meant to do, like talk over people, explain things to them, pitch them. I think most people watching this would know it as the old-fashioned features and advantages sales. So it all felt horrible to me. So that's where I started. And I quickly realised that actually there's another way of doing it. And I learned very early on to ask questions. And that was about as technical as it got. So I built my whole philosophy of sales in really committing to asking great questions to somebody that's shown an interest. And that's a key distinction. And really committing to listening to what do they need, what do they want, what are the problems that they are experiencing, what are the results they'd like to get. And really I just start to, by fluke, to be honest, Alexis, just come up with my own version of conversational sales, really. And I think that's the major background. And then I ended up running a business, family business in the retail sector. So selling tiles and bathrooms over the counter, face to face initially. And then it got, we dealt with some companies like Next and John Lewis. So, we negotiated some bigger contracts, but a lot of it was learned close sort of conversational selling, really. So that's the background.
That's really nice. And was there a particular moment or sale where you kind of came out of the pitch or came off the call or came out the meeting and thought, I did it differently, or that just landed well and you got that sale? Or was there a particular moment or a series of moments where you kind of really felt like that crystallized for you?
Yeah, I think I did a bit of work in the photocopying industry as a 19-year-old, 20, 21 years old. And one of the things I noticed that I did differently, if that makes sense, was to ask questions and really genuinely listen and understand. So I learned this, again, a little bit by fluke, is that you're not meant to sell something to somebody every time. And actually that's quite a big distinction even to this day. So I think when I realized that my job wasn't to get someone to buy, but it was to guide somebody that might be interested by answering questions, sharing information, understanding what they need, and almost being a bit like a GP or a doctor, really. It's like gather the information first and then decide whether or not we should continue second. I think that was just I hated rejection, feared rejection. So I was like, well, how do I get it so that I find people that are interested, ask them loads of questions until there's no questions left, and then present them with some options and then let them choose which option or which experience they'd like to go with. And that was a big distinction for me. And from learning that as a younger man, that's been my philosophy ever since. That's what I teach.
I love that. And what then led you to writing your book, Open with a Close?
Well, when I was in the retail showroom in the family business, in 2008, some people listening to this, particularly the older ones like me, might remember something called a global recession, or it was called the global financial crash. And also another word that was used was credit crunch.
Yeah.
And at the time, we'd invested quite a lot of money in our business and we weren't feeling the credit crunch, but it was obvious, there were problems. And then I think that was the year when all the banks went bust. The banks ran out of money. So it's like, that is a real problem, isn't it? When all the banks have got no money left, it's like, we've got a real problem here. So I think like that period of time, we had to go old school because we'd invested a lot of money in our business, like hundreds of thousands. We were in retail, we invested in a piece of land and we built a 6,000 square foot 2-story showroom in South Birmingham just as the recession was happening. And most of my competitors were like throwing money at marketing as it got tougher. And we were like, we had no money. So we were like, we didn't have any money to throw at marketing. So we went with our communication skills and we went with our existing client base and we moved towards all our existing clients. We're like, hey, who do you know right now, despite the economic crisis, that is investing in their bathrooms, in their kitchens, in their homes, in their buildings, in their businesses? And that sort of process enabled us to trade through the recession, really our sales and communication skills. So when I eventually left that company, my brother bought my shares out of that company in 2017, and I was going to have a bit of time off. I lasted about 3 or 4 months, and I started to do a bit of consultation work for somebody that we both know, a guy called Nick James, and we know him well. He's my business partner now. And what I didn't know, Alexis, is that the lessons that I'd learned in the retail industry and from the photocopying industry and from knocking on doors, the human-to-human interaction side of it, what I didn't know is that was, well, one, was it transferable into the person I was consulting for? And Nick's business is a business mentorship program, and it's around business growth. You're in it, you've been a part of it, so you understand. But for anybody listening, it's like business mentorship, business growth, strategies, that kind of stuff. And he wanted a bit of help with increasing his sales. And when I started to consult with him, what I didn't know is whether or not my philosophy, my framework, my style of doing things was transferable. And it was very quickly we hit it off very quickly, and I think that's because we had value alignment. Our values were aligned, and I think anybody selling anything, I know you're very high on values. It's important to have a set of values that you operate within. And Nick and I sort of just collided, and as I started to consult for Nick and then some of his clients, the results were really powerful.
Mhm.
And it was then that I started to realize that I'd got information that small to medium sized enterprises at the time. I now deal with companies. My biggest client's like 325 million now, but then it was more SME. And I realised that I'd got information that could help people that maybe were struggling after the recession or maybe gone bust. And I decided to write it as a tool
Mhm.
and as a gift, really, to not. I didn't write it to sell anything. I wrote it as like a sort of like, here's how I do it, here's how I sell, here's how I communicate. There's some structure to it, and there's some guiding principles. And I thought, well, I'm going to put that back out there, and hopefully it helps people. And I remember being really scared to do it, and I held it off for ages. It was ready for ages. I didn't publish it. I didn't get it over the line. I was like, why would anybody listen to me? I had that little sort of negative talk. But eventually I got it over the line, and a great publisher, Rethink Press, helped me do it. And I have to say, I genuinely mean this. Even just sitting here now, I had a message this week from somebody I've never met before, I don't know. They don't live in this country. And it just said, "Dear Matt, thank you so much. I just read your book. And for the first time ever, I've realised that sales is just a conversation between two human beings. I didn't try and get them to do anything. And I made a sale. It felt really nice. And thank you." And honestly, to this day, I still am gobsmacked about how much love I get from
That's
from
amazing.
people. And that's why I wrote it. Sorry for the long answer.
No, I love that. I think, and I love that your approach to writing the book very much mirrors your approach to sales, right? Rather than going, right, how am I going to get the sale necessarily? It's how am I going to deliver value? And in your sales approach, you're asking great questions, as you said earlier. But then in the book, it's delivering great value and helping answer some of their biggest issues and so on. I think, I love Open with a Close. I think you've done a fantastic job in that book. And I know from having worked with you how much depth of understanding there is and how you work that balance really well between having a very sophisticated understanding of selling and lots of tools in your tool belt, and yet then turning that into something that's quite simple that anyone could do. And I think that's a real gift and something that I think you're strong at. If you had to kind of pick some of the key principles or steps from your approach so that someone could start to get a sense of how they might apply it into their sales process, what would that look like?
Yeah, thanks for those kind words. I appreciate that very much. And I think sales, I always know when I'm doing a good job as a trainer when people say to me, "This is really simple."
Mm.
And, you know, that is actually a big compliment, because if somebody turns around and says this is really complex, it's unlearnable. So I think that's the first thing is I think sales should be natural. And anybody watching this will know what I'm talking about. If you've got a telephone voice like, "Hey, good morning, how are you?" Like, don't speak like that. What humans that are buying are looking for is one thing, really, and that's certainty. So it's like, act from, your normal natural energy, your normal style. Like, don't try and be somebody you're not. You're not fitting us to be anybody's judge. Don't make them right or wrong. Like, buyers can change their mind. They can ask for another quote. They can go somewhere else. They can ghost you. It's a buyer's market. So I think it's like a real guiding principle is to be natural and to speak to other human beings as you would yourself. And I also think there's a respectfulness about that too, and that is, you're not meant to sell something to somebody every time. Like, let go, let them make the decisions. I always say when the buyer or the possible buyer is like making all the choice, like when they're in choice, you're in control, not when you're trying to control the choices that they make.
Mm.
And I think that is a pandemic for salespeople that are often, good-willed people, but focus more on their targets and commissions. So I think if I could summarize that better, it would be to genuinely have the best interest of the buyer at heart, and to not be attached to whether they do something or not do something. That's not really the job at hand. I like to see, the way I teach salespeople is to be a guide for somebody that is interested in the kind of results they could get from your service or from your product, and to be a guide, not a judge and jury. And I think that's actually quite a big distinction that a lot of untrained people get wrong. And I think a couple of other key principles is to ask and commit to listening. Like, ask questions, don't use assumptions, don't use presumptions. And you hear them all the time, don't you? I've just been doing a coaching call with one of my clients who said all people in London at the moment are finding life difficult. And I just went, that is the biggest presumption I've ever heard. It can't be proven. There's not one person in London that's investing in health and fitness at the moment. Of course there is. And I think assumptions and presumptions create rigor mortis really in sales. They're the thing. They're the things that cause the biggest problems. I always say, if the salesperson is the reason why somebody doesn't buy, that's the time to go and get them trained pretty quickly. So yeah, ask questions, don't assume. And then I think lastly is to be detached from the outcome. If you can bring some of those principles into the way you sell, it's a game changer. It really is a game changer.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think because I think those are key. I absolutely love them. One of the things that was really landed for me as something that I hadn't been good enough at in basically all the businesses I'd had to the point of coming across your work was that principle you mentioned early on was around certainty. Like, buyers buy when there's certainty. Can you talk a bit more about that particular principle as to what you mean there, and what does that look like for a business, for a salesperson, for a sales process?
Yeah, great question. I think firstly, humans purchase results. So what a buyer is actually looking for is something they can walk away with. And if that solves a problem or accelerates a result, you really are in business, really. So that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is, if there's a result to be had, then it's really for you to understand, by not getting that result, what the problems are. I think that's what great salespeople do is understand that bit. And your question was for me to clarify. Which bit do you want me to clarify more? Sorry.
Yeah, so I think it on the certainty piece, like one of the things that I've seen in my own and other businesses is that there's a lot of it depends. There's a lot of, oh, well, that can change and this can change. And as a result, it actually makes it hard for a customer to buy because they don't have clarity on what am I actually buying? As you say, like the results that you're getting, what's the approach, what actually happens, what's even the price.
Yeah.
And I've definitely seen that I've seen that in my own business, I've seen it in others, where there isn't that clarity, that it's not stamped into your ways of working, your sales process. So as a result, the client doesn't know quite what they're buying. And as a result, it's difficult for them to make that decision. So interesting, like maybe an example where you've seen that and the difference that it's had between giving a potential client that certainty and not.
Yeah, and I think it's really about giving the team, if you've got a sales team, giving them the skills and the certainty they need to operate from a place of peacefulness. And instead of using language of uncertainty, which is, as you mentioned earlier, lots of ifs and buts and maybes, and here's a classic, and they go, oh yeah, we're interested. Can you send us an email with some ideas? And then one of the team sends a load of ideas. It's like, don't do that. Why just send a load of ideas to somebody until you understand exactly what it is that they need? And it's like, no. So I think it's about creating a skill set, a way of communicating, and giving the individual that's selling everything they could possibly need to feel confident, and not to be cocky or to be arrogant or anything like that, but just to be a great communicator, to have some structure, so some answers, to be following a simple process, like getting into a car. It's like it's to have something that's repeatable. I think the biggest problem that I see with untrained salespeople is that they wing it and they just say stuff. And the problem is, as a buyer, you can smell bullshit a mile off. So, like, you can tell if someone's winging it. So it's much better to be authentic and to be uh, honest and straightforward and transparent when you're selling. And I think the ones that wing it, they're the ones that use sense you shouldn't give money to. And you normally tell them a little lie and say, like, look, that sounds great. I can see the value. Appreciate your time. Pop it on an email. I'll get back to you. And if those are the responses that business owners hear, something's going wrong really badly somewhere, because that's all polite language for, like, no, it's not. That's not how it works. So yeah, I think from a certainty point of view, a buyer, and it's a buyer's market, has to make sure that when they invest time, money, and energy in a product or service, that money is going to a company that has bothered to train their salespeople, that the money is not going to disappear. We've all heard of these companies that come and go. And I think by training up your staff to communicate properly and sell well with some ethics and integrity, it creates more certainty in buyers. And you just notice that you get more money and you get more contracts signed, as opposed to when you've got salespeople that wing it and just say stuff, tell lies, and do anything they can to get a commission check.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I've definitely seen that difference in different businesses between where they themselves, as either the business owner or the sales team, have a winging it approach versus having that structure, and the impact on performance is stark, which I'll come back to in a moment to ask you about specific examples. But the one of the things that strikes me is that, as you mentioned, you don't want to be winging it. You need to have structure. And previously, outside this podcast, we've talked about things like the relevance and the importance of a script. And people that have listened to this podcast will have heard me talk about, detailed checklists. And indeed, my team have checklists for how they do their sales calls and discovery calls and so on. However, one of the concerns, I think it's a legitimate concern that people have, is that balance between having clarity and certainty and a process and an approach and a script that you follow versus not then feeling too formulaic, too scripted, too uncomfortable. And I think I see people worry so much that it's going to appear scripted or anything, that as a result they go for the winging it approach, which I think is actually worse. You'd be better off. I think it would be more powerful as a salesperson to say, I'm not a very good salesperson, so I follow a checklist to make sales. Is that okay? Like, that would be better than going, hey, yeah, let's have a conversation. But like, what's your view on it and how to get that balance right?
Yeah, it's tremendous subject to be talking about. It's like a pilot, isn't it? I'm sure when a pilot gets into an aeroplane, they probably don't need to do all the checks because they know how to fly the plane. But praise the Lord, they do, because a mistake is very costly. And I think this is the same, particularly in a world where we're all investing so much time and money in marketing and generating opportunities, that, like, the salesperson that is well rehearsed, permanently well practiced, the salesperson that sees this as their number one priority, to be as good as they can possibly be, that isn't emotional and takes emotion out of it and brings some logical process into play. That's the salesperson that drives sales, drives growth, and does it in line with values and integrity, and you create long standing relationships. So I always use, like, if you think about elite sports people, or if you think about, let's take, say, Usain Bolt, for example, or you could take something like a great singer, Celine Dion or Andrea Bocelli or something like that. Do they go into a performance? Let's say Andrea Bocelli, when he performs, like, is he doing the same thing every time? Well, like, the fundamentals and the principles, yes. So, like, the sort of, like, hitting the notes and all that, like the larynx and all of those principles are. But then there's the human to human interaction. There's the energy in the room, the human Wi-Fi, so to speak. and that's untrainable, and that is not meant to be scripted in any way, shape, or form. And the way I teach salespeople is I go, look, why don't we get to a place where when you enter into a sales conversation, let's say, that you have got the recipe, the framework, the guiding principles, the structure, and the habits. And that comes through permanence and practice, like the habits, the muscle memory to go into that situation where you go, whatever happens next, I've got everything I need. And then what happens is you stop thinking in your head, because I've always said, if you're in your head and you're overthinking it, you're dead. And then you can just go into your heart, which is what I say. When you're being smart, you're in your heart. And all I mean by that is if you go out for a drink with your best mate and you haven't seen her or him for ages or where it might be, like you might on the way there be thinking about, well, what are the one or two topics that we probably might catch up on? But then when you're in the conversation, you're not thinking, well, if he says this, I'll say that. And if he doesn't say this, I'll do that. Like you don't think like that because you've got all of the human interaction skills you could possibly need. You're in peacefulness. You're able to say what you want to say. And that's because you've had many conversations. So you're not worried about what might or might not happen. And I always say, like, if your team's not practicing this kind of stuff, then they will wing it. If they don't have skills, they'll fall back on, doing things that don't work. They'll avoid difficult conversations. So yeah, I think framework, practice, good principles, all of these things are what elite performers do. And then in between the gaps, the human-to-human interaction, I like to invite intuition. I like to invite vision. I like to invite creativity. I like to allow for the profile of the buyer, their personality to come into play. And I always think like there's a non-spiritual, there's a non-physical side to us all, which comes out, through tone. It comes out through love, through energy. I think bring all of that into play as you see fit within the framework. I think lastly, a good way of thinking about this is if you think about great actors, and your favourite films. I just watched one of my favourites is Gladiator. So, I don't know who wrote Gladiator. I could probably find out. I don't know who directed it. I could probably find out. I know Russell Crowe was one of the main people, right? So when the director and the writer flew Russell Crowe into a hotel in London or New York or wherever it might have been with his agent, what they'd have done is that they've given him the script and then have said, like, learn it and then make it your own. And I think what they wouldn't do is like, there's the script, just ignore it and do what you want. And when you put it like that, you go, oh, okay. So if I want to be great at sales, then all I've got to do is really like learn a recipe and then make it my own. Okay, I can do that. And again, I should imagine, I'm not an actor, but I should imagine like the great actors are rolling with the punches within the guidelines to make it feel real. And I think anybody that thinks about it like that is going to give them a better chance.
I love that. I think that analogy of the script that's given to an actor, I think is so powerful and appropriate here, because I can totally see how, as you say, it makes it so obvious that not providing the script to the actor is ridiculous.
Anything
and there are of course films where things are improvised, but it's designed, like the whole design is different, and that's not how they make blockbuster films like The Gladiator. Those things are scripted, and what's interesting is that analogy also gives us some insight into the level of detail that you need to go to, because to some extent it's what needs to be in the script is what matters, what makes a difference. So if, for example, it matters that as part of that little scene that he gives a sideways glance to the sister of the enemy or whatever, and that's an important thing, then it would be scripted in. Whereas what you wouldn't want is Russell Crowe like forgetting to do that or doing that and he's not meant to have done, and it creates a suggestion of a completely different narrative that isn't meant to be there. And I can see how, as you say, like the script is what you're giving to your salespeople to say, this is what works and will help you get the results. But then your training, your coaching, your practicing is what gets you to the point of, and they can deliver it, and it feels natural, and it feels natural to them as well as the customer. In fact, that's probably an even better way of looking at it, particularly given what you said earlier on around the important to be yourself and the natural you, is actually, rather than to say to the salesperson, hey, I want you to practice this and get good at it so it's natural to the customer, it's probably better to say, no, until it's natural to you, until you feel comfortable dealing, doing this in a very way that's you, and so on. I think that's a lot easier for them to take on and look up on the results.
If you think about a craftsperson that comes to your house, like a plumber, something's gone wrong with a pipe, they turn up with like 2 boxes. My dad's been in the trade for years, and he's got like boxes with loads of things in it. He doesn't use every single one of them. But he gets the piece of the tool that he needs for that specific job. And sometimes he even needs to remind himself, like, I haven't used that one for a bit, and I'll just check the manual and whatever else. So yeah, the way I like to teach it is to give the salesperson the toolbox and the skills that they need in a habitual way, so that you're not having to think about, oh, you said it's more than I want to spend. One sec, let me just check my script. I'll get back to you in a sec. Can't afford it. Right. What I meant to say now is, like, you don't want that, because it's not conversational, and great sales in the 21st century is meant to be conversational. So I think, it really comes down to, again, skill set. Again, if you think about Usain Bolt, right? If he's running a race and with 20 meters to go, he's not quite where he needs to be, what does he do? He goes to a burst technique and reminds himself as where his elbow needs to be or where he needs to drive. He picks the technique that he needs in the moment to give him, that 1% in that moment, and that will be coming naturally, because, you see him run for 10 seconds. What you don't see is 3 years, 364 days, 9 minutes, and 50 seconds of practice and core stability work and power training and nutrition and stretching and core stability and yoga and, like, no alcohol, and, like, you don't see all those bits. And I think I was in a negotiation in Europe a few weeks back now, and there were 5 negotiators and one of my team members and me, and like, it was a hard negotiation. These guys are steely, well trained. They actually have negotiation training. And you can see that they've got good principles and tactics, and like, if you're not able to operate at that level, they're gonna eat you for breakfast, and it never works. So, I believe in equilibrium, and that humans should do business on the same level, and like, if you go into a negotiation underskilled, you're a dead man walking or a dead woman walking. So why would you do that? If you've got a serious service and a serious business, and you want to build lifelong relationships with people, and you want them to be moving towards the solution rather than you trying to talk them into it, then get your team skilled, give the staff the training they need, and then commit to excellence and commit to practicing and create a culture, and become known for, in a competitive world, become known for the company that has the most ethical sales process, become known for the company that operates in negotiations from a place of values and service, become known for the company that says no to the wrong relationships early, become known for the company that has the best communicators in it, become known for the company that provides the best client experience when somebody's buying. And all these things are available to us if that's what we want to become. And, we get to create the business and the life that we want, and for me, I think back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and certainly when I was first coming into sales, you needed the gift of the gab. You needed to be able to talk a bit of shit, give it all that one, the old car salesman, you had to have that kind of stuff. Nowadays, you don't. You can it's expected that you can hold a conversation from a place of respectfulness, that you can have structured conversations, that um, you can be quiet and great at sales and still ask a powerful question. You can be, a calm, considerate human and still get on really well. No problem at all. I think, it's a requirement now, isn't it, to give people the skills they need?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the ability to, in the moment, as you say, be that level. You've evoked examples of Usain Bolt and so on. Actors, Russell Crowe. That's the level, and it's why your business is the elite closing academy, right? It's not the quite good closing academy, and that's what you look for, right? Is creating these elite closers in people's businesses that can do this, and I think that craft around it and that practice is what makes that. I'd be interested, because one of the things that I know that you are excellent at is something that you've mentioned a few times, which is asking great questions. I know that it'll depend on the product, the customer, where you are in the journey, and so on. What are some of your favorite great questions to ask potential customers?
Yeah, love it. I mean, firstly, I always go towards vision when I first meet someone. So I always want to find out what vision they've got in their brain of what an amazing result of investing in my product or service looks like. And I'm happy to hear them out on that one. So again, I see lots of salespeople trying to get me to see what they want me to see, because that makes it easy for them and they walk away with a big commission check. Like, I'm very much like, share your vision. What do you need from us? How can we help? Help me understand you. And I think if you can go there first, it's a game changer. That's what actually the open with a closed philosophy is. Start with the end in mind. And then if you can turn that vision or dream that the client's got into a reality through your service, progress and start, if you can't, don't try and come up with something and try and turn, an elephant into a donkey or a circle into a square. It's like, you got to say, hey, from the answer you've just given me, I'm definitely not the right person. I can't help you with that, but I could be a stakeholder for Alexis Kingsbury. You need to go and see Alexis, or you need to go and see my friend Nick, or whatever. And I think if you can start there with your questions, game changer. And then there's a framework that I've used all of my career now, since my early 20s. And what I worked out is, when people used to look to buy a bathroom or tiles, they're what I would describe as a non-essential. So without questions, the only thing the buyer's got is the price. So if it's just on price, I'm always going to lose, because I wasn't trying to be the cheapest tile and bathroom showroom in the world. I was looking to be in the mid to upper, and to provide a service as well as a product, So what I learned was that even though it was a non-essential, there were sort of four key areas that I needed to ask about. One was pleasure, or, and it's more prominent the other way around, to be honest, but in the non-essential, it is pleasure first. Pain. So what led you to move towards us today? Like, what result were you looking for, or what are you looking to solve? So again, think about somebody that buys a bathroom. They're either looking for a nice, beautiful new bathroom, or the bathroom they've got is leaking or something. So the number one thing is, you need to find out pleasure or pain. The next one is urgency. Like, ask questions around urgency. How long have you wanted that, or how long has that been a problem? Like, understand how urgent is this to resolve for that person right now. So again, pain questions, pleasure questions, urgency questions. The third one is really need. Your clients or possible clients should be able to describe to you in great detail from their prism what they think they need from you. Not you telling them what you think they need, because they won't understand it. And you'll like literally blow their brains, and they'll say, pop it on an email and I'll ring you back, and they won't. It's paralysis by overanalysis. You're the expert, so don't talk in expertise language, because you'll lose them really quickly. So what do you think you need from me is a great question. That and often people do. They're not stupid. You've got to trust the buyer more. In the 21st century, they can find out a lot of information on, as my mom calls it, the Google web. There's a lot of information that buyers are looking at before they get to you. It doesn't make them an expert. It just makes them well informed. So find out, like, what do you already know? What do you need? And don't make them right or wrong. Just let them speak and encourage them to say what they think they need more. And then the last one is trust. You can have pain, urgency, and need. If there's an absence of trust, you'll never do business. So, and the way you build up trust, by the way, is by mastering communication, by allowing them to feel heard, by genuinely listening, by being concerned, by having the best interests at heart. That's how you build trust. Not this, hey, build rapport, ask them about their dog and find out how things are at their end and all that shit. It's like, no, don't talk about my dog. Don't talk about my kids. That's not what we're doing, right? I've got all my own mates. We're not mates. And again, if you're listening to this thinking, bloody hell, that's a bit harsh. Of course, if you're in rapport with someone, you can talk about kids and mates if it's relevant. But the point I'm trying to make is you'll earn trust a lot quicker by asking questions in order and sequence and being a real pro, is my experience. So ask questions around pain, urgency, need, and trust. And then finally, make sure that the answers are qualitative or measurable. So find out what that really meant. We live in a world where people don't say what they really mean, you and I included, all day, every day. Imagine if you just said what you really thought to everybody all the time. You'd either be locked up or you wouldn't have any friends. So remember, don't take the first answer to a great question literally. Explore, find out what that really meant, follow it down the rabbit hole a little bit. A good example of that is, if somebody sort of says it's more than I want to spend, like, what were they meant to say? Is that all? Why don't you double it? Like, people say things that they don't mean, so you have to explore what that really means. So yeah, that's the framework. I call it punt with a Q: pain, urgency, need, trust, and qualitative information. And if you can ask questions around those five during the sales process, you'll find that exchanging contracts becomes a lot easier because you've had the awkward and onward discussions, you've moved towards the truth, you've found out the real problems, and there'll just be a much more trusting basis between both parties.
Fantastic. So, and it's such a smart model. Since learning it, like we introduced it into our sales processes. So my team are using these sorts of questions as well. And I think it's really, really powerful. You've had incredible impact on lots of businesses, including my own.
Thank you.
Can you give me an example of like a favorite example, or like a specific thing that happened? We've spoken in the past about various examples and some work you did recently that had some incredible impact, where I think you had a customer that made 1.2 million or something in sales in 30 minutes during the training that you're running. Like, give me an example of kind of either scale impact or one of your favorite impacts that you've had.
Mate, great question. I think if I just took what you just said, to hear an amazing business owner with an amazing product like you say to me that I've had, or my training has had a big impact on lots of businesses, that's the moment there that I'm living for, because you go, businesses are vehicles for our communities to thrive and for us to make a difference on the planet, as well as make a few bob along the way to support our own dreams and goals. And I think if my little training company can add to that, even just 1%, to your company and to your family and to your staff, then like, that's heaven in a little bowl for me, really. It's like, that's impact right there. And I think that the purpose of our company is to develop people. So if becoming a better communicator and making sales easy and elegant and graceful within companies, and not conflict and not greasy and not an Achilles heel, which it is for so many people, unfortunately. If we can continue to do a little bit of that every day, and it's not just me now, I've got an amazing team that support me. That really feels great to me, because I believe in serving others, and I believe that when a human being is looking to buy something from somebody else, if we can create a win for the buyer, a win for the seller, and a win for the universe, you go, amen, we've cracked it. It's like everyone wins, and that's probably the best example I could give. It's like if we can do that multiple times a day, a week, a month, a year, then we have a compound effect, albeit a small one, on the globe, where we're just making a tiny weeny difference, and that feels great.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love that. So, Matthew, you've been incredibly generous with your time. You've given such great insight in this episode, and so I hugely appreciate you for that. How can people find out more, learn more? I mean, we'll include in the show notes, we'll include links to the Open with a Closed book and your social media profile on LinkedIn and your website. Like, what would you recommend as the best next steps for anyone?
All of those, I think you're probably right. A great way. Look, my philosophy might not be for you, and that's okay too. There's plenty of great sales trainers out there, and there's plenty of, I follow a few myself, so it might not be for you. But I think the Open with a Close book and audio book, for example, the audio book is on all major social media platforms, Amazon, YouTube, Spotify, and Audible, any of those platforms. Give it a go. I wrote it so that, believe it or not, I'm actually not that logical. I've got a little bit of logic. I'm more emotion, but I wrote it in a very linear, logical way because I wanted to create a simple framework that people could follow. And you can read the book or listen to the book in 2.5 hours. It's read by me, so you'll be fluent in Birmingham accent by the end of it. But yeah, you can 2.5 hours of study in the gym, on a walk, and give it a go and see whether or not my philosophy fits into your style. And if it does, follow us on social media, and we're in each other's world.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. Massively appreciate you taking the time for this episode. And yeah, it's been absolutely awesome having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we've developed some super useful templates and sample processes for business leaders who want to solve some of their biggest problems permanently. These include guidance on what processes and guidance needs to go into a sales team manual, how to make your marketing more consistent, how to make managing people painless, some of the biggest problems that people have. So to access some of those and to sign up to get all of them, including new ones as they become available, go to scalingwithoutstress.com. That's scalingwithoutstress.com, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well. Otherwise, thank you again to Matthew. And a final note for everyone listening, we need your help. If you found the content today valuable, just take a quick minute, subscribe, like it, leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. It'll help the podcast get more visibility, ultimately allow us to help more people. But otherwise, until next time, have fun.